Hello and welcome to Brainspace. I'm your host, Hitar Tadeshi. Today for our first episode, we have come to discuss one of the most deadliest conflicts in Europe ever since the Second World War, the Russo-Ukrainian War. The Russo-Ukrainian War is a wide angle with many sides which need their own episodes to be discussed. However, for this one, we will just be focusing on the outbreak, events which led up to the war, and the major players and their interests. So you, maybe understandably so, might be rather confused by the headlines in your local news outlet. After all, there's a lot of propaganda out there. So what better place than to get your information from here, a normal teenage boy simply launching a passion project. Let's start from the beginning. Once the USSR, or the Soviet Union, a union of 16 different states collapsed, tensions began to heat up between the new republics and their former ringleaders in Moscow. Mikhail Gorbachev, the premier of the USSR before its collapse, had launched Glasnost, or publicity and openness. What this allowed Soviet citizens to do was criticize the government, as Gorbachev believed that this would allow for Soviet citizens to be happier. However, it turns out that when people receive freedom, just like me in a buffet, they want more and more and more. This eventually led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was attributed to many other issues besides Glasnost. However, that's for another episode. With the collapse of the Soviet Union came the independence of Ukraine. Ukraine declared its independence as the Republic of Ukraine on 24th of August 1991. However, there came a massive problem. You see, the Soviet Union had the largest nuclear stockpile in the world, and these nukes were placed all over the country. Not just in Russia. Belarus, Kazakhstan, and most importantly, Ukraine had nuclear assets inside of them. As these nations were newly independent, they couldn't handle the cost of maintaining an operational nuclear program, so Ukraine made a deal with Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom to give its nuclear weapons back to Russia, in return for safety guarantees in case of war from all three nations. As the United States and the United Kingdom did not want nuclear weapons in the hands of more nations and were wary of a Russian invasion into Ukraine, and as Russia was slowly looking to join the West, they signed the agreement. The agreement was known as the Budapest Memorandum, and it quite obviously was a resounding failure. Fast forward to 2014. The Revolution of Dignity takes place in Ukraine to get rid of the pro-Russian and insanely corrupt President Viktor Yanukovych. The revolution succeeds, bringing Ukraine back to the West. However, Russia sees this as a threat, as Ukraine's ties to the West were forever bitten after the Revolution of Dignity, and it launches an invasion into the Ukrainian province of Crimea, capturing and annexing the province into Russia. This forever destroyed the relations between Ukraine and Russia. Around the same time as the annexation of Crimea came insurgency in the Donbass region. The regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, which were made mostly of Russian speakers who are more pro-Russia, broke away due to the new Western-aligned government in Ukraine and formed the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic. Guess who backed these secessionist movements? None other than our good friends in Moscow. That was the last straw for Ukraine, which led it to pursuing more dialogue and possibly even joining NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a defensive alliance between the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, France, and many more nations. However, as this alliance was made in the Cold War as a counterweight to Russia, the Russian Federation did not want this. Talks with NATO spiked drastically in the 2010s as more and more nations began to join NATO to get protection from Russia. Russia had the last straw. Fast forward to the special military operation in Ukraine, I say that in quotation marks, where Russia has officially sent 16,000 soldiers into Ukraine and has just mobilized the draft for the war due to the poor front conditions they're facing. After facing multiple losses in Ukraine, Russia has now called for a military draft of its populace, which has led to an exodus of Russians fleeing the nation into nations such as Georgia or Finland. This has led flights to some cities to rise in price drastically. Flights to Dubai from Moscow have increased by nearly 2,000 dirhams, which is nearly $600 in just a few weeks. No matter who you may support or whatever your ideology is, I would just like to remind you that this is a war at the end of the day. Innocent Russians and Ukrainians are dying within the conflict, and while it may seem like statistics to us miles away from the conflict, it isn't so to the Ukrainians and Russians fighting it for their homelands. So please, embrace your humanity and pray for the people involved. This is Hetad, signing off.